Last week I reacted to Jeff Nippert's tiered list of glute exercises, and this week I'm reacting to ATHLEAN-X's tiered list of glute exercises. Now, this is 2 years old, but it's great content. It's really good to hear other people's thoughts and then for me to share my thoughts on top of that. So, in case you don't know ATHLEAN-X, he has 14 million followers on YouTube. That's got to be more than any other fitness YouTuber, right? I can't think of anyone who even comes close, to be honest. So, very influential guy. But glutes are my jam, so let's get down to it.
And so even a high foot placement doesn't save this exercise's placement at the bottom of my list. The leg press has got to go. What's up guys, Jeff Cavalier, ATHLEAN-X.com. What you see behind me is a bunch of different leg exercises, specifically for the hamstrings and glutes. And they share a lot of functions together, so we're gonna group them together. But not just that, I wanna help you to find the ones that are actually worth your time. Because we're gonna do what we always do here, we're gonna rank them from the best to the worst, leaving you only with the best exercises capable of delivering the gains that you're after. All right, so as always guys, in our exercises ranked series, we have to define the criteria for the inclusion of these exercises in this list. Number one, they have to be capable of being progressively overloaded. Can you continue to increase the resistance to keep those gains coming? Number two, can you do these exercises and create muscle growth and hypertrophy as the main focus? Sure, there are strength exercises, but for this list, they have to create muscle growth. And number three, guys, as a physical therapist, as always, each of these exercises has to have one thing in common. They all have to be
done by me.
Oh, God, where have you been?
I've been hanging out in the back. Where have you been?
Why do you have to do the exercises?
Oh, I'm the one with the juicy booty, remember?
Oh, I wish you'd stay away. Listen, they all have to be safe. And by being safe, what I'm talking about is they can't compromise pain in order to deliver the gains that we're after here, guys. So each of these exercises is going to fit that important criteria. And so as always, we're going to start here at the bottom of the list in the worst category and work our way up. And as I mentioned in the open here, the hamstrings and glutes actually do share some functions together. Both of them are capable of extending the hip or bringing the leg straight back behind the body. But the hamstrings also have the capability of bending the knee. So one of the worst ways to do this, unfortunately, is one of the most popular exercises and ways to do it. It's the prone hamstring curl. But before you get too excited, trust me, there's going to be better options ahead. The reason why I don't like this particular version of the exercise is because of the position, being face down. And as you struggle to get that weight up and really try to get your feet into that end position, we oftentimes will drive our thighs down into the pad. That engages the hip flexors, which as we know, attach to the lumbar vertebrae, which can start to pull on them and result in low back pain or spasm. Not the way we want to really try to build our hamstrings. Now, as I mentioned, the exercise does fit the criteria of hypertrophy and overload, but again, knowing that there's better options ahead, I'm not willing to take that trade-off. So for me, it's going to start at the bottom of the barrel with a big red X. Next.
You know, the prone hamstring curl, the lying leg curl, I love that exercise. I always liked it more than seated leg curls, but a recent study was published showing that seated leg curls led to greater hamstring growth than lying leg curls, but it was on beginners. And the researcher, Mao, he never disclosed the type of equipment he used. I like to look into that. I looked into it, I couldn't find, I believe it was the lying leg curl. I couldn't find a picture of it, or maybe it was a seated leg curl, but I don't know what equipment they used. This group of researchers never includes pictures, images, videos, and it's annoying because you want to see how it was done. And a lot of the research published on lengthened training is by this group, Mao. And what if they don't even know how to lift? Who would know? Some of these younger researchers, Plotkin, Milo Wolf, Pack. This is the new wave of researchers. They're including pictures, they're including videos of their subjects, so there are no doubts as to how the exercises were performed. But talking about lying leg curls, a lot of those machines are flexed. They have you significantly bent at the hips, and Jeff looks at things from a lens of a physical therapist, so he's looking at safety. And we always think of anterior pelvic tilt as being a bad thing, but think about it. When you're in anterior pelvic tilt, what happens? The hamstrings get longer, you increase their length. So if it doesn't cause pain, I have no problem with purposefully anterior pelvic tilting to get a better stretch on the hammies. You can also purposely flex the hips more or buy a leg curl machine that has more hip flexion in it, and then you make it more like a seated leg curl. But if you have a seated leg curl, then don't try to make them the same, train the different lengths.
I have a glute exercise, and this one you've probably seen before or done, and it's just a simple heel press. Now this is a bodyweight exercise, easily done, no equipment limitations here to get in the way. However, it still doesn't make it very high up my list. Why? Well, it's very much incapable of the overload that we seek in order to build muscle. You're doing mostly a bodyweight movement here, and it's also very limited in its range of motion. Even when it's done correctly here, you're talking about a very limited 10 to 15 degrees of motion for the entire exercise. And even more than that, it's oftentimes misperformed because this is one of those exercises that easily leads itself to muscle substitution as we start to rotate the hips, taking away some of the effort from the glute max. Guys, this is definitely one that belongs here at the bottom, and it's not going to...
I mean, no one even does that exercise. That's like a warm-up, so yeah, who cares about that? I wish Jeff did this more recently to get his take on like all the modern exercises that have blown up on, you know, Instagram, TikTok, etc. lately, because he'd undoubtedly have a whole new list
to deliver the gains that you're looking for. So between the last exercise and this one, I kind of feel like I'm pissing off a lot of people in my audience and a lot of the females. But it has to be said, and I'm trying to deliver you the best information, and that exercise that has to go next is the step mill. And you guys have probably seen this, and maybe even seen the people who, you know, add that little flare of the hip extension at the end. It still doesn't save the exercise. Why? Well, a lot of times, these step mills are actually powered, which means that as you step, the motor on the machine brings your leg back down into extension, not the muscles in your body. That's a problem. What makes this worse is the only muscles that are working are your hip flexors once again, just to lift your foot up onto the next step, only to take that ride back down. It's not going to get you where you...
And I've heard that with treadmills too, that like the belt pulls your leg down and you just have to lift your legs up. But no, that's not true. I don't agree with that from a physics standpoint. Like, yes, the steps are descending, but think if you had a giant escalator and you're running to the top. You aren't just going to use your hip flexors the whole time. You have to power your way up the entire thing. I don't think it changes the muscle activity that much, whether you're doing it in real life, like climbing stairs versus using the step mills. Same with sprinting on a treadmill versus sprinting over ground. It doesn't do the work for you, and you're just using hip flexors to lift the legs up.
Want to be, and it could lead to some of that back pain we talked about. Now, sometimes you'll be lucky enough to find a version of the machine that you actually power by driving your foot down into extension. But at the end of the day, any exercise that can be done for many, many, many minutes in a row becomes less anaerobic and therefore less likely to deliver muscle gains and more aerobic.
Totally agree. At the end of the day, it's cardio. Cardio does not build muscle like weights do.
It doesn't fit our categories or criteria here, and therefore it also is going to get a big red X. And so if my ladies out there got maybe a little bit mad at me, this time I'm going to give everyone a chance to. Because the next exercise on this list is the leg press. Now look, I understand a lot of people have used the leg press as an alternative to a squat, especially if they have knee pains and problems, and maybe even had seen some gains along the way. My issue is, as a glute developer, it's a horrible exercise. There's no way around it. And I know people say, well, Jeff, that's maybe because you're doing it incorrectly. You need to put your feet high up on the platform in order to get more glutes and hamstrings. It doesn't save the exercise, guys, and here's why. First of all, when we put our feet high up on the plate, what we get is a lot of hip flexion. A lot of hip flexion, actually. You may not be able to see it until I take the position at the bottom and I simply turn it to a standing position as you would at the bottom of a squat. And there's no squat you've done that's ever looked like this, for good reason, because it's not a great way to do a squat. With this amount of hip flexion, what oftentimes happens is you get an extreme amount of posterior tilt and lumbar flexion that can compromise the stability of the low back and the SI joint. Two things we don't want to do. But more than that, when we go back and we extend our legs, look at the excursion we go through. What is the range of motion on the exercise?
All right, so in Jeff's defense, a lot of this research didn't exist a couple years ago, but the leg press done this way is actually theoretically an amazing glute exercise. Well, first off, we actually have a couple of published studies showing good glute growth with leg press. So it's not theoretical at this point, it's been tested. So leg presses do grow the glutes. Now, I used to agree with Jeff because I tested the EMG on myself, but I think maybe I was sitting on the electrodes or something because I got such low glute activity with the leg press. However, our study from 2023, Plotkin et al. 2023, showed that EMG did not predict muscle growth. And the reason why with the glutes is because when you stretch a muscle to long lengths, for some reason the glutes shut down. They don't activate that high. They don't electrically activate that high in the stretch. But stretching can grow muscle and activating a muscle can grow muscle. So kind of two pathways there. So EMG predicts the active component of muscle force, and then length change or excursion predicts the passive element or the passive muscle force part of the equation. But the leg press is a length and partial. And then Jeff says you would never squat this way. That actually would be the most glute dominant squat possible. Just totally bent over like that. When you have that kind of like your knee being right here into your chest, that maximally stretches the lower glute max. And then you drive it forward. Yes, it's not moving through a large range of motion, but it's a length and partial. You might move out to where you're at a 90-degree angle, and then you look at that's when a hip thrust starts. Then the hip thrust takes you from that 90 degrees to full hip hyperextension. So in theory, leg presses and hip thrust would perfectly complement each other, train the whole length, but you can never get your all out of one exercise. One exercise doesn't do it all. So the way I see it, leg presses are freaking great for training the glutes in a lengthened position. Single leg presses, double leg presses, done with a high foot position. They're way better, way more torque at the hips, less torque on the knees. You can even go sumo if you want. If you go narrower, it's a little more stretch. Wider, maybe more activation, but I love leg presses. I used to not. I've changed my mind over the years. Maybe Jeff's changed his mind a little bit, but he does accurately mention that some people get injured from leg presses, and it's because of that posterior pelvic tilt, that butt wink in deep hip flexion. You gotta figure that out. You gotta learn how to avoid that, because I've seen a lot of really bad injuries on the leg press. In fact, in 2006, my business partner had to be ambulanced out of the gym. He had to be taken away on a stretcher. He messed up his low back so bad he couldn't even walk out of the gym. So yeah, leg presses can be dangerous if you don't know what you're doing. So you got to learn that aspect, but once you master that aspect, you don't have to worry about it. You know how to keep your lumbar in check. You can get that high foot placement, make it super glute dominant. You almost want your shin being perpendicular to your torso at the bottom position.
Remember, hip extension is what we're looking for when we're trying to train the glutes. We've gone through very little hip extension. We went from extremely flexed to moderately flexed, but still never even close to neutral, let alone extended. The exercise does not do a good job of targeting the glutes, therefore it's going to stay here at the bottom of the list with the big red X right through it. And so with that, now I get to break out my blue marker as we head up the charts here into the better category. And for this, we need to go back and look at the same position we just talked about with the leg press. It's the dumbbell reverse sprinter lunge. And yes, you might notice that same chest to thigh position, but there's some very different things going on here. Number one, with that one leg left behind us, we're actually neutralizing the pelvis a little bit and relieving some of that excessive posterior tilt, which makes this exercise a lot safer. But more importantly, in terms of the effectiveness of it, we're overloading that hip extension. We're getting not into that abbreviated range we saw in the leg press, but we're able to overload it through much more active hip extension. This is one of my favorite ways to do the movement, and for those of you who I mentioned that had knee pain on squats, this is going to give you a chance to relieve yourself of a lot of that pain and still get the gains that you were looking for in the first place. So for me, it gets the first blue circle.
I've never heard them called sprinter lunges before, but yeah, I agree with everything he said about those. You just don't see those very often, but theoretically, those are a great glute exercise. It's kind of like an exercise I talked about called the Romanian Bulgarian, where you kind of combine a single leg RDL with a Bulgarian split squat. Same concept. You're taking a reverse lunge, you're involving more range of motion, and you're making it less quad dominant and more hip dominant. So agree with that.
In the better category. Next up in the better category is one of those step ups from the exercises that were in the worst category. And if you're going to do those heel presses, you might as well do instead a standing cuff kickback. And this is where you take one of those cuffs and put it around your ankle and just kick back against resistance. And that's the key, against resistance. Because what was lacking in that first exercise, as you remember, was the overload and resistance capable of creating any type of muscle growth. Well, here we can get that. And more importantly, while it may still encourage some of those muscle substitutions that we talked about with the heel press before, being on your feet proprioceptively allows you to move your leg back easier in a straighter line. So while it's still a small range of motion, it's one that you can perform more effectively and easily, and as I said, overloaded, it gets the next up in the better category with the...
Okay, so yeah, cable kickbacks, there's so many ways to do them. Those ones he showed, very stable, he's holding on. I love them. We do them at the end of the workout because they don't fit into any category. It's not a squat lunge, it's not a thrust bridge. It technically is a hinge, but you don't want that to be your main hinge exercise. You want your hinge to be a type of deadlift or good morning or back extension or reverse hyper. These make for excellent exercise to throw in at the end. They don't beat you up much. What I love about the kickback, it matches the strength curve of the hip extensors. So the hips are about 2.5 times stronger in deep hip flexion compared to full hip extension. And if you look at the moment arm of this exercise, it's probably around 2.5 times longer in the full stretch position than in the full squeeze position. So it really matches our strength curve to where it's kind of hard throughout the entire range of motion.
The blue circle. And so when it comes to exercises that hit that posterior chain, both the hamstrings and the glutes, the RDL and its many variations are always going to find their way on that list. However, when we're looking for aesthetics or athletics and we want to get the balance that we might lack right now, splitting up the legs one at a time is where we're going to turn to the dumbbell single leg RDL to accomplish that. And what I like about this exercise is it does give me a chance to either focus a little bit more on the hamstrings by keeping the leg a little straighter, or a little bit more on the glutes by allowing the knee to bend more as I lean forward. So if your main pursuit was to grow bigger hamstrings, the overloaded aspect of this with the dumbbells will give you that leg up. However, because the balance might become your limiting factor, it's not the best option for you. So it's going to get a ranking of better, but just not best yet. We have better options coming.
Totally agree with everything he said there, but that's why we do braced single leg RDLs, or you can do them off the Smith machine or the hammer strength deadlift, like a plate loaded device, for more stability, because I agree. And if you don't have anything to brace onto, you can do B stance. Because yeah, these really lack stability and it impairs your ability to maximally fire the muscle. Now, I would also argue with RDLs, you do bend the knee more. So if you want to target the hamstrings more, you do a stiff leg. I don't call that an RDL, I call it a stiff leg deadlift versus a Romanian. Romanians, you are bending the knee more to get more glute stretch.
And so with that, I now get to break out my yellow marker as we continue to work our way up the charts, this time to the better still category. And what I like to do here is give you that next best option that I just mentioned. And we're talking about the single leg RDL. Well, let's start doing it with a cable rather than a dumbbell. Because what this does is it gives us all the same benefits we just talked about with more stability. Why? Because the cable actually gives us more control in the frontal plane. What I mean is, if you held that dumbbell in your hand, it could kind of float in all three directions. But with the cable, you're actually controlling that side-to-side frontal plane motion a little bit, which actually lends additional balance to you, which takes that exercise that was supposed to be driving those glute and hamstring gains and actually allows it to do so without having your balance undercut you. So it gets the first in the better still category.
I have no problem doing that with a cable, but I still would want that cable to be vertically loaded. What he did there was he made it an angle, which changes the vector, and now it becomes kind of more horizontal-ish. It does not require as much hip extension torque in the stretch position. It requires more hip extension torque at end range in the squeeze. But in my opinion, you shouldn't try to turn an RDL into a squeeze exercise. You do squats, lunges, split squats, step-ups, Romanian deadlifts, and leg presses for the stretch. You do kickbacks, 45 hypers, reverse hypers, hip thrusts, and glute bridges for the squeeze position. You don't necessarily try to make squeeze exercises stretch movements, and you don't try to make stretch movements squeeze movements, because you just do them both separately and they perfectly complement each other. That's my take.
And so I promised you I wouldn't bury the hamstring curl altogether, that I'd give you a better option. Well, all you have to do is change the way you perform the exercise, and this is sitting on your butt. That's right, a seated hamstring curl is a much better option. Why? Because we're fixing all the things we saw wrong with the earlier versions. And you can see that when you perform the exercise from this position, your knees and thighs actually go down towards hip extension rather than into hip flexion as you bring your knees back. And what's good about this is you still get the ability to grow those hamstrings through isolated knee flexion and overload, but we don't have to have that negative side effect that came by just being in the opposite prone position with our knees driving into hip flexion. All those low back pains go away, but the gains are actually here.
So I agree, the seated hamstring curl is amazing for hamstring growth, but the way he was performing it, I want to see that full stretch at the top. In fact, if you have good hamstring flex, I want to see the L position. The bottom position, I want to see straight legs, an upright torso. I want it to be an L. And if you have even better hamstring flexibility than that, in fact, you can lean forward even more. But I want full knee extension at the top of the movement, get that full stretch, and that's what's gonna grow the hammies the most. So in that example, it was missing out on like the top 15, 20 degrees of knee extension to maximize the stretch torque on the hammies.
Much better alternative for those looking to use a machine. And speaking of improvements, let's keep them coming. Instead of doing those heel presses or even the standing cuff kickbacks, you have another option here. It's the banded step through. And what you'll notice about this exercise is that it gives you more range of motion, so therefore more resistance through hip extension, making it a better exercise. And once again, the bands will give you the opportunity to progressively overload to a higher resistance band, which will continue to allow you to progress the exercise as needed. Now, this is one that I like to use with my athletes, not just because of what I just spoke about, but also because it tends to help you as a mobility drill to get into deeper and deeper hip flexion. There's a lot of good to say about this, and it's certainly the best variation we've talked about so far to accomplish the same thing, so the banded step through gets.
Okay, I've never seen anyone do that exercise before, but I don't think you get a lot of length change throughout the band just because of the band being overhead. As it moves, it's not going to get much stretch. So I don't agree with that being an awesome exercise. But that step through motion can be done with a high pulley position with a cable column. So you can do cable kickbacks that way. You can also kind of do that with the assisted chin up machine. You can't get full hip extension on it, but you can kind of load that step down motion. I like that. Most bros would say that exercise sucks. They'd say just do step ups. I actually really like that exercise. But now they're making machines like Max Pump makes a machine. I haven't tried it. Glute equipment is on the rise. People are making crazy machines now. You got Max Pump, you got Glute Builder, you got Booty Builder. So yeah, I don't agree with Jeff about that being awesome, but I do like that motion, and theoretically it's an amazing way to train the glutes if you can provide tension throughout the entire range of motion.
It's the yellow circle. Now, if the criteria for this list was to choose exercises that were capable of driving high levels of conditioning and power, then this next one would be way at the top of the list, but it's not, so it falls here. We're talking about the kettlebell swing. Now, this exercise is one of the best ways to train the glutes and to do so explosively, but it also almost automatically guarantees that you learn to hinge properly. And the hinge is the foundation of glute activation. If we can learn to hinge properly at the hips, then we can engage the glutes at the right time and learn to ultimately recruit them and grow them better. Now, the limitation is oftentimes the load that we use here. Unless you have access to a very heavy kettlebell or one that's challenging for you, you're not going to find the ability to overload this enough to keep the gains coming once you've reached a certain point. But it certainly is an amazing exercise and one that deserves a spot here up high on the list, and the last one in the better still category. And so now I get to break out my
kettlebell swings. I so agree with Jeff on this. It's not the best hypertrophy exercise, but if you give me someone to train and they're proficient in kettlebell swings, then I'm gonna have the easiest job as a trainer teaching them squats, Romanian deadlifts, hip thrusts. It's crazy because swings are hard to master, but if you do swings early on in your career, for example, back in the day, RKC was really popular. Whenever I'd get someone who was like RKC certified, their form was amazing on everything. So it's kind of like, I wish more people spent time earlier in their career learning swings. It just seems to build a really good movement foundation. But back in the day, I had a 203-pound kettlebell. In fact, I feel like I was the first one to ever get it. I ordered it off Amazon. I remember the shipping was so expensive. This was like 2012. This was like 13 years ago. And yeah, I could swing that thing for like 20 reps. And I can't tell you how freaking hard it is to swing a 203-pound kettlebell 20 reps. I even wrote an article for T Nation back in the day. Are heavy kettlebell swings better than dynamic effort deadlifts? Meaning like powerlifters do explosive deadlifts. I think they should be doing heavy swings. They're harder and they're harder through the full range. But now I've come to believe that neither one are that good for powerlifters. I think you should err on the side of more specificity and just do more volume with lower RPE or more RIR. Powerlifters lately are doing way better by doing more volume, but not pushing it so hard on their sets, leaving more reps in the tank, not taking sets to failure. So they're lasting longer and they're performing better. Because back in the day, everything was to failure. But I digress. Kettlebell swings, great for building movement competency, not the best for hypertrophy because it's an explosive lift. And to maximize tension on the muscle, you ultimately need to grind out those last few reps, and you need slower muscle contractions in order to maximize hypertrophy. Owing to the force-velocity relationship, that's how you get maximum tension, which is why I like hip thrusts more than kettlebell swings, because the hip thrust is kind of like a kettlebell swing with just heavier loading and the ability to grind it out. So, agree with Jeff there.
green marker as we continue to work our way all the way up to the top, but we're stopping just short here in the almost best category, and the place we're going to start is with an improvement on those kettlebell swings. We're talking about the pull through. Now, once again, we have a ground-based exercise like the kettlebell swing, which I like, but we also get a chance to load this a little bit more heavily because we have the option to just move that pin up the weight stack more and more to accommodate our increasing strength gains and ultimately size gains. Now, I also like the fact that this is once again reinforcing all the good things about the swing through that hip hinge overload. And what's nice about this exercise is oftentimes for people, when you remove the speed component of the kettlebell swing, they have a much easier time getting to a good glute contraction, which ultimately is going to drive the hypertrophy you're looking for. So for me, the pull through gets the first green circle in the almost best category.
I started doing pull throughs in, I think, like 2009, and I quickly could do the whole stack, and then I was pinning 45s to the stack. I remember pinning a 100-pound plate to the stack. I'd have to lean forward so much to not, it was ugly, okay? So really strong people, you almost overcome the ability to perform pull-throughs. Because your hip extensor gets so strong, you can't stay put. It would tip you backwards. That being said, here in Glute Lab San Diego, we got really creative. We would wear a belt connected to a cable column. We would hold on to like sled handles or even partners holding your hands, and we'd do that motion. We'd even do it kneeling to take the hammies out of it. We do kneeling with bands. We do them with cables. We do them braced for maximum stability. That was a staple for a while, and then we just gave up on it. But side tangent, it's 2020. COVID quarantine. One of my star clients, Booty Brianna Alexander, she had a roommate that was immunocompromised, so no one was allowed to leave the house. And she couldn't come to Glute Lab. So I would load up my truck and come to her and train her in her driveway and just not make contact. And this really happened. I gave her band kneeling hip thrusts and she was doing them, and a FedEx driver comes by and delivers a package, and he sees Brianna like humping against the band resistance, and he just takes off, and he broke out into a sprint and ran into his truck and like squealed his tires out of there. He must have thought we were doing something naughty. We looked at each other and just died laughing because what did he think we were doing? But yeah, that was popular for a time and then it kind of vanished. I do like band kneeling hip thrusts when you can hold on to something. It's so stable. Some people love them, some people don't. Just like kneeling squats, some people love them, some people don't. But back to pull-throughs, I like them for pregnant women. They love them. I never bash exercise too much, but in my opinion, it's like, why do a pull-through when you can do a hip thrust? It's more stable, you get greater loading. That doesn't mean I don't allow them in my gym. If someone likes them, have at them. Throw them in at the end, but once you get strong, it's just not enough. I like that Jeff thinks for himself and doesn't just follow the bandwagon, but I just don't think pull-throughs are that good.
To me, this next exercise is one that's way too often underutilized, but one that we use often with our athletes, and it's the dumbbell leaning forward step up. And what's great about this movement is you can easily load it depending upon the weight of the dumbbells that you grab. But what's nice is just by changing the orientation of your body prior to starting the exercise, you can shift the load more from the quads to the glutes and hamstrings. So we just assume this forward tilt of our torso before we start the ascent on every rep. So what this does is it just preloads the glutes. So now as I press down through my foot and drive myself up and get as close as I can to full hip extension, and I even have that good eccentric loading on the way back down again. I can train one leg at a time to overcome those muscle imbalances and weaknesses. It's going to get another green circle here in the almost best category.
I love that step up variation that he showed, the glute dominant step up. Love it. I do think some people would be unstable with it, especially when you use really, really heavy loads. If you're shorter, you can actually do step ups off the Smith machine. You can do Zercher step ups. No one ever does them, but they're more stable. And if you can't do it, you could just dump the bar forward. But yeah, dumbbells, you can lose your balance. So I like braced. But the problem is you can get too strong. When you're doing braced, you hold on to something for stability and you have dumbbell loading in one arm. You can get too strong for that to where, what's the heaviest dumbbell at most gyms? 100 pounds? You know, a lot of my girls could do 100-pound step ups. We did high step ups a little more upright because you get more stretch. But then I realized, no, you don't have a lot of torque loading compared to when you just go to parallel and lean forward more. So now we do step ups like that. In fact, this reel I made on Instagram was one of my most popular reels I've ever made on why we switched from doing step ups like this to this. And I remember it got me like over 12,000 followers from that one reel. After that, every influencer I saw switched to doing step-ups like that. It was probably one of the most influential reels ever made because that marked the beginning of every influencer doing step-ups in a glute dominant fashion. So I like to see that Jeff was talking about this a couple years ago, kind of ahead of the curve on this glute dominant step-up. But I do think there's better ways to do it than what he showed, just trying to get a little more stability. Now, also that being said, I hate when people just act like anything unstable sucks, because now we've gone to where everything has to be Smith machine or plate loaded, and they act like you can't possibly get good at a free weight exercise while still being stable. And that's not true. If you've trained people for decades, you know we used to always just use free weights and people didn't just fall over all the time. You get coordinated, you get good at things with free weights.
And so I mentioned before that the glutes and hamstrings prefer to work together. If we had an exercise that allowed us to overload and resist knee flexion and also hip extension, then we would have a great exercise. Well, this pair of exercises actually allows you to do just that, and regardless of whether you have access to the equipment, you're going to have an option to do it. And we're talking about either the glute ham raise or the slick floor bridge curl. And what you can see here is, again, that coordinated effort between the glutes and hamstrings. On the glute ham raise, you get that initial contraction from the glutes to stabilize the pelvis and assist in the driving of the whole body up into this knee flex position. And of course, this is a tremendous overload on the hamstrings. And we could actually increase the load here as we want to by simply adding an additional plate if needed. But let's say you didn't have access to this machinery. Well, you could do what I always show here is the slick floor bridge curl. And this is a bodyweight variation, and it's a lot harder than it looks. You're basically doing the same thing here. You're starting with a glute bridge through good hip extension, maintaining that throughout, and then actively and dynamically using your hamstrings to curl your legs in and back out. A good eccentric overload here too. The key, as always, is to keep your glutes really, really high while you're moving your feet back and forth. And even here, if you want an additional overload, try to do this one leg at a time. It is not easy. Either way, you're getting that holy grail, that good combination of the activation of both those muscle groups together, and therefore
12 years ago, I wrote an article for T-Nation gutting the glute ham raise, and I said, you put glute in the name and people think your glutes are working. It's a hamstring exercise. The knee flexion torque so far exceeds the hip extension torque, especially when you factor in their maximum capabilities. Like our hip extensors are freakishly strong. All they're doing in a glute ham raise is keeping your torso level. It's really a knee flexion hamstring movement. But if I was doing glute ham raise, I would put the foot position way higher. In fact, you want the feet a little higher so that the shins are horizontal when you get to the bottom of the movement. And in my opinion, you just want to come to parallel or a little bit below. And then the slick floor bridge curls, it's funny, I never prescribed those ever. But during that quarantine, people needed body weight exercise. Well, that's really like one of the few hamstring exercises you can do from home with no equipment. So my Booty by Bret members probably got really sick of hearing about these as an option, but I had to cater to people training from home during that period. So those are great exercises. I actually like them so much, I invented a hamstring track for the hammy track and roller. My buddy Bert Soren from Soren-X invented the glute ham roller. I invented the track for it, so combined together you got this super stable exercise. It's so good. You can do hamstring curls on flat ground, and then when you get really good, you can do them with your torso elevated on a bench. This is so hard to do. I can barely do them with 2 legs, but I have clients who can do it with 1 leg with freakishly strong hammies. All right, let's move on.
before it gets that big green circle in our almost best category. And so as we've done here a few times on this list already, we've made the improvements. And now we're going to make that ultimate improvement when it comes to the RDL. So instead of the single leg variations, we can now move towards the classic barbell RDL, and with good reason. Because if you're pretty confident that you don't have any of those underlying left to right imbalances, then this is going to give you the best chance to overload the exercise and create the most growth in both the hamstrings and the glutes. And again, with a lot more stability since you're not in any single leg balance situation. An additional plus for the exercise is it's a good accessory movement to help you if you struggle at all with that end range of a deadlift. It just has a lot of utility here, and it's one of the best exercises you can do for the posterior chain. It has to be on this list, and it has to be somewhere at the very top.
It's funny, RDLs have gotten so popular. I feel like they're more popular than deadlifts now. Like, really. Romanians are the most popular deadlift variation in existence right now. They're more popular than sumo, more popular than conventional, more popular than trap bar. You almost never hear of trap bar deadlifts anymore. It's kind of funny when you've been around for decades to see the trends, but the RDL is such an amazing glute exercise, and there's so many good ways to do it with the barbell. I like doing it off the pit shark or off a belt squat apparatus. There's so many good single leg RDL variations. My favorite being single leg abducted or hip supported. But with the RDL, I've even changed the way I teach the RDL to where I will allow the knees to go forward a little bit. So you have a little bit of forward shin angle, some forward knee migration, and that allows you to get a deeper stretch on the glutes. So if you're like me and you feel all hamstrings in a typical RDL, move your knees forward just a little bit at the onset of the exercise and then move back, and you'll feel even more in the glutes and less in the hammies. But I totally agree with Jeff here. The RDL is one of the best glute exercises in existence. Let's see what he picks for number 1.
The almost best category. And so any good list of leg exercises wouldn't be good if it didn't have some variation of a squat on it. For us, it's going to be the low bar variation. And there's a reason for this, because it sets your body up to recruit the posterior chain muscles more effectively. By simply carrying the bar lower on those lower rear delts, you're going to have to pitch your torso forward at a bit of an angle. What this does, as I mentioned before, is it recruits those posterior chain muscles more effectively, and it carries through as you go down into the bottom portion of the squat, allowing you to more effectively drive out of the squat and also handle heavier loads. The progressive overload was never in doubt here, nor was its placement at some point on this list. Ultimately here, way up high, the low bar squat is going to be the last in the almost best category.
Okay, I love to see low bar squats. A lot of women don't like low bar. They like high bar, but most bros like low bar. But yeah, lean forward, sit way back. Coming up in strength and conditioning, everyone used to think the squat had to be so upright. And if you lean forward at all, you get criticized on social media by everyone. And now I'm very glad to see that the forward lean has become accepted. And now we have a consensus that it works more glute. I think going to parallel, doing low bar and leaning forward a ton and keeping the shins pretty vertical, even using a box squat if you can, so you reach the same depth every rep, is the best way to squat for glute growth. In fact, I love the same on an angled Smith machine too. I like it even more. The angled Smith machine low bar glute dominant squat is probably my favorite way to squat for glute development. And then second being with the BC bell standing on blocks, leaning forward like that. It's so smooth. And I'm glad Jeff included a squat variation on here because squats are legendary for building the glutes. So agree with Jeff there. Let's see what he picks for number one.
Some of you might be thinking, but what about some of the other exercises that Jeff has shown in the past that have been very, very helpful? Well, I would consider those corrective exercises, either done for neuromuscular activation or to overcome a glute medius weakness or some sort of hip imbalance. They wouldn't necessarily find a home on this list when we're talking about hypertrophy and growth. However, stay tuned, that one's coming.
Well, it's kind of cool to see those exercises he's shown.
And so that leaves us with only one, and of course there can only be one when it comes to the best of the best. You weren't looking over my shoulder the whole time, were you? Well, whether it's a surprise or not, we're talking about the barbell hip thrust. And this exercise simply checks all the boxes when it comes to glute development. Yes, you can progressively overload it very easily. Yes, you can perform it safely, and yes, it's going to provide the muscle hypertrophy that you're looking for. Or as Jesse said, it's going to help you grow that juicy booty.
Ooh la la.
The reason why this exercise sits way up here at the top, even above our beloved squat, is because muscle activation studies will prove how much more superior this is when it comes to recruiting the glutes on any exercise. Throw in the fact that the resistance curve here is superior as well, ensuring that we have a heavy load placed on those glutes in peak contraction. Guys, this is just the best exercise when it comes to delivering the gains that you really want, and it also has those hamstring isometric benefits built in as well. This is going to get that green star as the best of the best in our glute exercise rankings.
I love that Jeff ranked the hip thrust as the #1 glute builder. Obviously, I agree with him, but I'm biased. I'm the inventor of the exercise. Jeff, get a bar pad. Jesus, that poor guy. Here's what we've learned since then with the Plotkin study. Yes, it has higher EMG activity, but it tied squats for glute growth. Even though they have higher glute activation than squats, the squat stretches you more and has more torque in the stretch. So theoretically, the squat would be better because of the better glute stretch and the more torque in the stretch position. But the hip thrust is so damn amazing. It's so damn hard in the full squeeze position. It produces so much active force that it compensates for those two things. And that's why you got the same glute growth. In fact, glute growth was a little bit higher, just slightly higher for the hip thrust group. It wasn't statistically significant, but everyone knows you can perform way more volume with hip thrust than you can squats. Like if I did my maximum volume on squats per week, I'm sure I could probably do 8 hard sets a week for squats. Anything more than that, I would get injured eventually. I would start to spin my wheels. But hip thrust, I could probably do 24 sets, to be honest. I could probably do 8 sets 3 times a week if I wanted to and recover just fine because they just don't beat you up that much. They work you at shorter muscle lengths so you don't create the muscle damage. So your body doesn't have to expend energy repairing damage. It can go straight to building muscle and hypertrophy rather than regeneration. And it doesn't beat you up systemically. You don't feel wiped out the next day. It doesn't lead to nearly as many injuries as like squats or deadlifts. But obviously, I think you should do both. You should do a stretch position movement and a squeeze position movement. And there's so many good ways to hip thrust. You've got the barbell like he showed, you got the Smith machine, and now you have all these plate-loaded devices and even selectorized devices from all the manufacturers. You've got BC Strength Thruster Pro, which I think is the best plate-loaded device. You've got Hammer Strength, which is second best. You've got Booty Builder, you've got Glute Builder, and all the other companies are making them too. I'm loving the fact that we don't have to set up the barbell all the time anymore. We can just hop on a machine.
So if you're looking for quads, that's coming soon. If you're looking for a chest or shoulders ranked video, you can find them here. And also, if you're looking for a complete program, you can get them over at ATHLEAN-X.com. Guys, click subscribe so you never miss a video when I put one out. See you soon.
I'm gonna conclude this video by saying, Jeff, that was awesome. You gotta listen to all the experts and hear their rationale, and you'll absorb some of the stuff from everyone. I've been listening to all the experts since the 90s. You know, I've never felt like I'm above learning from people. So I enjoyed hearing Jeff's thoughts on these different exercises, and I also think it's really unfair to react to something that someone did a couple years ago. But I'm trying to resurrect my YouTube channel. I know Jeff's thoughts have changed in the last couple years. If someone reacted to a video I did a couple years ago, I'd be pissed. I'd be like, dude, we didn't even have half of this research that we have now. So Jeff, I'm sorry I did you dirty there. If you're not following Jeff, definitely do so. He's a legend. Like I said, he has more followers than anyone in the game. He's a YouTube pioneer. Jeff, thank you for providing me with the opportunity to share my knowledge. And to my followers, if you like this stuff, let me know in the comments, because I'll try my best to keep doing it, keep reacting to people's videos. Or do you just want me focusing on my own topics? Let me know in the comments. Make sure to give me a follow, and please make sure to hit like if you like what you saw. I'm Bret Contreras, AKA The Glute Guy.